Does America indeed have a border security crisis going on right now?
Yeah, Jay Johnson, who was secretary under DHS secretary under Obama, once said, "Look, 1,000 people showing up at the border a day is overwhelms the system, and we've had many times that number showing up at the border every day for the last 3.5 years." So, and he's right. It's almost impossible to accommodate that many. And other statistics we have say, yeah, the border is it's reasonable to say it's been out of control, though the scale at the border has gotten better in the last 2 months. Is that a trend? We don't know, but it's still enormous, even in the last 2 months. Well more than 1,000 a day.
Welcome to Thoughtful Money. I'm its founder and your host, Adam Taggart. Pretty much every poll shows the economy remains the #1 voter issue in the upcoming US presidential election. And many of these same polls show that immigration and border security as the second most important issue. Concerned by reports of a surge of undocumented immigrants crossing the border illegally in recent years, many voters worry about the economic, social, and political implications of this wave of bodies and wonder if America can effectively absorb them. I recognize this is quite a sensitive topic, one that some would say is outside the purview of this channel. But this issue does have important economic implications, and from what I hear from viewers, many regular Americans feel they just don't have a good sense of the facts of this situation. So that's why I'm sitting down today with Dr. Steven Camarota, who serves as the Director of Research for the Center for Immigration Studies, a non-partisan Washington, D.C. based research institute that examines the consequences of legal and illegal immigration on the United States. We're going to do our best to lay out the facts of the situation at our borders in as nonpartisan and impartial a manner as possible. Steve, thanks so much for joining me today for this important discussion.
Thank you for having me.
All right, Steve, look, there's a lot to talk about here. I think what I'd like to do is maybe start by just getting the facts of what's happening with legal immigration in this country, and then moving on to what's happening with illegal immigration. We're going to have I think, a very deep discussion about this. Real quick before we go in there, if I can just pull the punchline up right into the start here, though, does America indeed have a border security crisis going on right now?
Yeah, Jay Johnson, who was secretary under DHS secretary under Obama, once said, "Look, 1,000 people showing up at the border a day is overwhelms the system, and we've had many times that number showing up at the border every day for the last 3.5 years." So, and he's right. It's almost impossible to accommodate that many. And other statistics we have say, yeah, the border is it's reasonable to say it's been out of control, though the scale at the border has gotten better in the last 2 months. Is that a trend? We don't know, but it's still enormous, even in the last 2 months. Well more than 1,000 a day.
Okay. And Stephen, also too, before we again go into the meat of the discussion here, can you just give a 30-second background on the Center for Immigration Studies and just talk about sort of your firm's point of view, your institute's point of view on the situation here? And the reason why I'm asking this is, this is a very emotionally fraught topic, and people are going to be curious about any biases in the sources here. So
yeah, I mean, my organization and my big bias is that we think that, and this generally reflects, I think, what most Americans think, but still there is a controversy there, and we could talk about it. Is that immigration should reflect the interests of the United States. It's certainly reasonable to take into account the interests of people who want to come. Many of them have family here, so that's important. But ultimately, the guiding principle of my organization is immigration should serve the interests of Americans. So we get to decide who comes in, and we get to decide the selection criteria. Now, that is sort of the basis of U.S. immigration policy. But here in Washington, there are lots of organizations that would say no, that people should have the right to come and improve their lives in the same way that you might have the right to move across state lines to get a better job or improve your life. That's not our position. We take the position that immigration is supposed to be, it should be designed and then enforced based on our interests.
Okay. And from a partisan standpoint, just want to clarify for the record, you're not aligned with any particular political party or anything like that, right? You truly are an apolitical, nonpartisan organization?
Yes, we are. But on, like, say, illegal immigration, we do think it's important to enforce the law, whatever level of legal immigration we set. And even that can be controversial. Most people say we should enforce the law, but then they typically, or some people, particularly libertarians on the right and many progressives on the left, they tend to object to every effort to enforce the law. So while everyone says the law should be enforced, there is this tendency to not really want to do that. We see a lot of that in Washington, and so, but we take enforcement seriously. So that is another bias that some people would say puts us on the right of the political spectrum. I don't think it does, but you could argue that.
Okay. I would say, just approaching it from a pragmatic common sense standpoint, that doesn't sound like a particularly left or right position to me, as just one for the rule of law. I'm going to try to keep my own personal opinions out of this conversation as much as possible. Just to the point you made there, I will mention really a point made by Elon Musk on this topic, which is that America doesn't really have borders with Mexico and Canada. It has borders with the world, meaning there is just such an overwhelming amount of people outside the US that would love to come live here, that if we truly had an open borders policy that just, hey, anybody who wanted to could come in here, we would most likely have billions of people arriving very quickly. And again, to your sort of pragmatic approach of just enforcing the rule of law that's on the books, is it seems pretty hard to deny that America would just become overwhelmed if we had a purely open border policy. So anyways,
Yeah.
moving into the discussion here, like I said, I do want to get to the summary that you just said, which is, hey, we do have a border that seems to be overwhelmed by the volume it's getting here. I'm making the assumption, you can disabuse me of it, but that most of that volume is coming from illegal immigrants versus legal immigrants. But let's start with legal. We have apparently a border policy in this country, and you can help us understand exactly what it is currently in terms of what's on the books, where we do allow people to come into this country. Presumably, we do that for two main reasons, maybe three. We need people to come here. This has been a nation of immigrants. Immigrants have been very essential to our economic growth over time because they have added to the ranks of workers here. So we need the bodies first and foremost to keep our economy moving. Secondly, we need skills, and so I'm hoping we have some sort of strategy that says, hey, we want to try to bring in certain skills into this country, and we'll use that as part of the selection process for who we bring in here. And then third, we have a humanitarian component to it as well, where asylum seekers, some percentage of people that are living in tough conditions in their countries, to the extent we feel we can bring them in, we'll bring in, whatever amount of that we feel we can take good care of. That's my understanding of how I think the country approaches legal immigration. Is my summary anywhere near correct to reality?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair point. We have family-based immigration. So first, you could divide immigration into two types, right? There is a permanent, that's the so-called green card. You come here and you can stay with your green card as long as you like and become a citizen in 3 to 5 years. That is very heavily weighted towards family members. So if you marry a foreigner, that person, and you're a U.S. citizen, or even if you're a legal immigrant, you can bring that person into the United States. There are rules and some limits in some categories. You can also bring in your parents. You can also bring in adult children. Some of these things have limits and caps on them, some don't. And you can also sponsor your siblings. And when your siblings or adult children come, then so might their spouses and their children come. Sometimes this aspect is referred to as a kind of chain or chain migration. So family immigration is about 2/3, depending on the year, of total permanent legal immigration. Total permanent legal immigration is about 1.1 million a year. So every year, And then in addition to that, we have the skills that you said. We have employment-based immigration, which is around 14 to 16% of the total. And then we actually have a lottery, which is around 5% of the total, where if you're from a country that hasn't sent a lot of recent immigrants, you can actually essentially, used to be actually a postcard, but you can send your name in, and then we draw it out of a hat. And if you win, you get a visa, and that's like 50,000 visas a year, roughly. And then finally, we have the humanitarian immigration. Let me give you a very broad discussion because there's a lot of confusion about that. A refugee is someone who is living typically outside their home country in need of permanent resettlement, not because they're poor, not just because of generalized chaos or problems in their home country. They have a fear, they've been persecuted or have a well-founded fear of persecution. So it's supposed to be, it doesn't always work this way because politics, gets involved in everything, but it's supposed to be for people who are more or less fleeing for their lives. And we identify them working typically with the UN and bring them in. So we fly them into the United States in effect. Now, there's a different category, and there are actually other categories, which I'm not going to go into. There's asylum. Asylum is someone who either is in the United States or gets to our border and says, I too fear for my life. Again, it's not supposed to be people who just live in a poor country, people who have generally chaotic conditions in their home country. You have to apply and qualify for asylum. And many of the people showing up at our border are applying for asylum. And we could have held them when their numbers were small, but we didn't. And so what happens is that we could have used other procedures and processed them more quickly. We didn't. We mostly, from the beginning of the Biden administration, and then more recently, have released them into the United States. Technically, a person with an asylum applicant is joining the illegal population because they're not supposed to be here. So they have applied for asylum, but they are not, they're what's called an inadmissible alien. They didn't qualify in any of those categories I had mentioned or in others, but we still let them in anyway. They are removable. We can make them leave anytime we want, but we're processing their asylum claim, and the asylum claim is maybe a decade behind now. In other words, there's that big of a backlog to try to get them their day in court. And that's a complicated process. I won't go into that. Then we have temporary immigration, and that is large. There are probably 3.5 to 4 million temporary long-term visitors in the United States, mostly guest workers, foreign students, and cultural exchange. And then finally, of course, we have temporary people coming in all the time. This is tourists and business travelers. And so those numbers are in the hundreds of millions, but most of those people leave. A certain fraction of all the temporary people don't go home when they're supposed to and join the illegal population. Before 2021, we thought that in that decade prior to 2021, that the majority of new illegal immigrants actually were those overstayers, someone who came in as a foreign student or a tourist and never went home. But now we think it's mostly people released into the United States. And the number of people released into the United States since the beginning of this administration defies belief. I could run through some of those numbers, but maybe we'll wait till we do illegal immigration.
Okay. Yeah, let's hold off on that for one sec.
Yeah.
So let me just make sure I'm doing my math correctly. So you said we have permanent legal immigrants. This is, a lot of the families you were talking about. That's about 1.5 million per year.
1.1.
1.1 that we let in through that year. Okay.
Yeah. About 2/3 is family, then 15% is the employment. About 10 to 12% is typically humanitarian, and then 5% is there was a little bit of wiggle room in each, is the visa lottery.
Okay, so for the temporary workers, and I assume they're here on work visas, what was that population roughly?
Right. So the total population of long-term temporary visas in visa holders in the United States is around 3.5 million, 4 million. And that's divided between the foreign students who come to study in the United States and the guest workers. Now, how many come in each year is actually a hard number to pin down. I know that sounds a little crazy, but we don't keep close track because those long-term temporaries last for years. You could come and study for 6 years,
Right.
and we don't keep close track of when they go home. And so we don't really know how many total foreign students. We can only estimate it. And we don't really know how many guest workers because they come back and forth. So you might go to a thing called the Statistical Yearbook of Immigration and look up, well, foreign students, how many came in? But that shows the same person entering multiple times. So you get some huge number, whatever it is, 2 million. But we don't have 2 million foreign students. We probably have more like 1 million foreign students. I mean, that number might even be 3 million. I haven't looked at it in a while. But it's not easy to know exactly how many foreign students we have in the United States. If you want to know, there are estimates, and the Office of Immigration Statistics has those. But we don't keep track. We never keep track that closely of anything when it comes to immigration. So one of the big things we don't keep track of is departures. So we don't actually know clearly how many people overstay their visas. We have an estimate. In 2022, it looked like 800,000, but did. So that seems like an awful lot, right? And a lot of that's tourists. But it may be because the airlines didn't do a good job of tracking people, or people may have flown in, but then gone out through the Canadian border, visited been a tourist in Canada, and then left from Canada. So there are a lot of reasons why this happens. But one of the weaknesses in the system is the lack of an entry-exit system. So just so you know.
Got it. And I'm presuming that if we were to know that somebody was here in a visa and their visa expired, it doesn't sound like there's much sort of enforcement, like we're going to go find that person and track them down. That's not going on.
That's not going on. Right.
Okay.
Exactly. If that person stays, there's not much to prevent them from renting an apartment and securing various documents, maybe illegally stolen or just fake documents, and working in the United States. And that's why we have a lot of people here. It's that kind of thing.
Okay, so we have this legal situation, legal setup that you've just mentioned here. I mean, it sounds like there's not a ton of oversight, or tracking's not very good. Beyond that, is the legal system working relatively well? Do we have the adequate resourcing to deal with just the legal component itself?
Well, if you'd asked me that question a couple of years ago, the generalized answer, very generalized, would be yes, and it was fee driven. So it's not supposed to be paid for by taxpayers, believe it or not. So that you apply for a green card, or after a few years you become naturalized. There's fees for all that, and it's supposed to cover it. You get an H-1B visa, you or your employer, whoever pays, covers it. So the tourist visa might not be an example of that so much, but the point is that the legal immigration system is supposed to be fee-based, but since COVID, they have been getting funds from general support, probably because the number of people who came in during COVID was way down, and we may be entering an era where it's no longer completely fee-based. That they don't have enough resources. But remember, there's tremendous resistance to raising it, right? If you want to bring your family in, it's understandable. You don't want to pay. Say you have a wife and a minor child overseas, or if you are an employer, want to sponsor somebody, there's a lot of resistance to bringing that raising the fees. And these are well-organized interest groups. It's understandable, and so that happens. And so I think what we're going to see, and what is increasingly happening, is we're going to subsidize it with taxpayer money, even though originally it was supposed to be fee-based. And so the agency is the State Department does a lot of processing of visas, just to be clear, and so does what's called USCIS, Citizenship and Immigration Services. And both those entities manage our legal immigration system, and both of them are struggling with funding. And either we need to, and there are proposals to raise the fees, especially on the business visas, but there's a lot of pushback on that, as you might imagine. So USCIS has struggled to some extent for funding.
Okay. All right. Well, look, I want to move on to the real meat of the topic, which is illegal immigration. Just, I guess, last question for you here on legal, which is, if you had to give us as a nation a letter grade on how we're doing with legal immigration, what kind of grade would you give us?
Well, let me, probably the operation of the bureaucracy and the processing. A lot of complaints, but given how much we're asking them to do, you'd probably have to give them a C. I think they do their job reasonably well. We have reasonably good professionals. They don't have enough resources and they're asked to do a lot. If you say, look, the goal here is family unification, well, within the context, you could always allow more people in. Well, I think the policy does a lot of that. If you were to say, well, I think what we should be doing is really selecting the most skilled people, then you'd probably have to give the policy a D or an F. We certainly don't do that. We don't select people very much based on their skills. And there's a lot of reasons, which we could discuss now or later, why the educational attainment and skills of an immigrant matter, but they're for exactly the reasons you would think, right? I mean, a person with more skills is more productive, pays a lot in taxes, doesn't use a lot in services. They tend to increase the productivity of the economy. They may drive or have a positive effect on innovation and so forth. And people who come in with a high school education may be perfectly decent people, but they're much less likely to have those positive effects. So if you want a very skilled flow, then yeah, you'd have to rate our system way behind most systems in most countries. Most countries like, say, Australia and Canada, which allowing a lot of legal immigrants, put a lot of emphasis on skills. We don't.
Okay. All right. So let's transition now to the situation with illegal immigration. I guess let's just start with the numbers. What are the volumes we're seeing right now, and how do they compare to history?
Right. So the figure you sometimes hear a lot is over 10 million border encounters under the Biden administration since January 2021. This certainly represents an enormous increase. In the past, this includes all the people who get caught trying to sneak across the border and all the people who present themselves at a port of entry, ask for asylum or parole or some other provision, who don't have a legal right to enter. And this is all borders we're talking about, including the northern border, which has seen a big increase. So that total of 10 million is very much unprecedented, though more recently we've used this term encounters. We used to use the word apprehensions, which is not exactly the same thing, similar, but that's unprecedented. But keep in mind, it can be the same person who we catch, put across the border sometimes, and then they come back. And that actually, that includes a lot of the people in that 10 million. So you don't want to say, oh, well, we've had 10 million new illegal immigrants just based on those encounter numbers. That's wrong. That's not true. But, and this is the big but. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I just want to ask this question so you can include it in your answer. When we talk about encounters or apprehensions or whatever, those are the people that we actually noticed trying to cross. I've got to assume that that's a fraction of the total people that did, and we can't know what the total number is, but do we have a finger to the wind sense of?
Yeah, I'm going to run through those numbers now.
Okay, great.
So how many people have actually been caught at the border and said, I need asylum, or I like parole, or I have a relative or an unaccompanied minor that we have to release, or at a port of entry, these things happen, right? They present themselves. They didn't try to sneak in. So the administration, the latest data we have is 5.6 million. They've released in the last 3.5 years, 5.6 million inadmissible aliens into the United States. Have we ever had anything like that? We have not. So that is unprecedented. In addition to that, we have observed 1.7 million in fiscal year 2021, 2022, and 2023 at mainly the southern border entering the United States on cameras, but we didn't stop them or turn them back. So that's 1.7 million in addition to the 5.6 million. So what percentage of them are still here? That's a more difficult question, but most presumably are. And that 1.7 million, we don't have the data for fiscal year 2024, which is just ending. And so that's probably another 600,000 on top of that number.
All right, sorry to interrupt, but do we have like a guesstimate of like, all right, that's 1.7 million that we caught on camera, but how many didn't we catch on camera?
Let's be optimistic. Some people say all kinds of statistics on that. So the short answer is we don't know. But it is likely that you don't want to say, well, 1.7 million or 650,000 a year, which again is several times. Used to be more like 100,000 a year we would see on camera. So what's going on now? Maybe 150 a year, but now it's crazy. But that number may not be as crazy high. What you might call entered unseen. The technical term is an EWI, entrance without inspection. And the number of unseen EWIs, if you asked me to guess, I'd say 500,000 at least.
Yeah.
So, but again, the 1.7 doesn't include the most recent fiscal year. You could easily have people success. The number of successful crosses of our border is well over 2 million, in addition to the 5.6 million we released into the United States. And so now, in addition to that, we have the visa overstay problem, right? So that was 800,000, but they haven't given us the numbers for 2023. Everybody thinks there must be really bad. That's why they're not putting them out. And that 800,000 can be very misleading. It's not the number who settled in the United States. A lot of those people just their departure wasn't recorded properly, and they only stayed a short time. But it wouldn't be strange to imagine that you still have to add 200,000 or 300,000 visa overstays for each year for 900,000 more. So the scale of illegal immigration with an asterisk, is like 9 million into the United States in 3 years. That's not a ridiculous estimate. Now the asterisk is, and this is something your listeners are going to have to decide themselves. If someone presents themselves at the border and says, "Here's who I am," and we process, they get an initial interview, and we release them into the United States as a matter of policy. Then a few months later, we give them work authorization. They have a social security number. They can get a driver's license. They can get a job, of course, with work authorization. Is that person an illegal immigrant? Technically, yes, and they are counted in populations of illegal immigrants. But it's the kind of odd situation is, well, we let you in. We gave you work authorization. So you, in effect, you're authorized to work. You're just not authorized to be here. So I want to point that out because it is a kind of odd situation, right? I think it's reasonable to be critical. Does that make sense? That may not be the way we want to do things, but that's how we are doing them. So, so that.
All right, and sorry to interrupt, but let me just make sure folks understand that. So, first off, is this pretty much the totality of the 5.6 million that we have encountered and then released into the U.S., where do we give them all work authorization?
No, we don't.
Okay.
Probably they've given remember, a whole bunch of them are children. Some of them are disabled. Some of them are old people. So, it's a human population. You never want to think of immigrants, monolithically. Oh my gosh, they're all from Latin America, or they're all working age men. Large fraction are, but a large fraction are not. So the data I've seen is there about 3 million have work authorization, something like that total. But that includes renewals of people already here. So be careful about that.
Okay.
I don't know.
I live in California, and we have, forever, there have been illegal immigrants coming here and picking fruit. Would that be an example of saying, hey, we kind of need these people here to do this job that Americans don't want to do, and therefore it makes sense to give them work authorization so that they can do it? Like, is that why we're doing this, or why are we giving them this work authorization? What's the logic behind it?
Oh, well, the administration is like, well, they're here. We're processing their claims. They need to support themselves, right?
Okay.
See, once you've let someone in your country, what are you going to do? Keep them out of your schools? Are they not subject to your laws? Don't you want the police to be able to serve them? Don't you want to, if they work, don't you want to have the labor protections? In other words, once a person's in the country, things tend to accrue to them, right? What if they get injured and they show up at the emergency room? Are you not going to treat them? Yeah, it may be tens of thousands of dollars for taxpayers, but are you not going to do that? I mean, in other words, once a person's in, to some extent, we don't have to give them work authorization, but a lot of other things happen. Maybe the way to put it is there's a cascading series of consequences. Now, agriculture, we just need to cover this because whenever you think of illegal immigration, the one group of people you should never think of as typical is agriculture. Agriculture is now, not if we had this discussion 40, 45 years ago, but now almost entirely irrelevant to the illegal immigration debate, because there are perhaps 500,000 illegal immigrants who work in agriculture, but the whole agricultural sector is only 1 million. And at the height of the growing season, you might get to 1.5 million, but the labor force is 160 million. You can't even get to 1% of the US labor force works in agriculture. Most estimates suggest that while illegal immigrants make up a large fraction of the agricultural labor force, Most people who work in agriculture are actually US born, and some are legal immigrants because a lot of the work is done on family farms, and those people are mostly US born. So if you have, most people think that about 4% of all legal immigrants now work in agriculture. And they make up 1% of the workforce or less. So you don't want to think too much about agriculture. Yes, that's a powerful lobby. We hear a lot about it, but agriculture, and you'll hear a lot about it in California, but the fact is, there are many more illegal immigrant construction workers there are many more illegal immigrants, working in hotel and hospitality jobs than there are in agriculture, just simply because agriculture is such a tiny, tiny fraction of the US labor force. The second thing to keep in mind is we have an unlimited agricultural guest worker program, and several 100,000 people do use that each year. There's complaints, mainly among the employers. It's not flexible enough. Some of it is probably legitimate. Some of it is they just don't want to pay enough. They don't want to provide them the housing that they're supposed to. So a lot of times employers go around the agricultural program. But we have H2A, it's called. We have a unlimited agricultural program, which is used significantly. So illegal immigration and agriculture, still a big topic of conversation. People talk about it all the time. Who's going to pick the fruit and so forth. But the fact is, it's largely irrelevant to the modern illegal immigration debate, even if it gets a lot of coverage.
Okay, good. Important clarification. Thank you. So back to the people that we're releasing into the country. So I get it then. I now get the logic, which is, hey, if they're going to be here for some period of time, like let's let them work so they can support themselves and not just be a total drain on the economy. Is the intent that when we release them into the country, is the intent that we're just doing this until we can fully process your application and then make a decision on it? And so is the theory that some material percentage of you we might actually send back once it's made its way through the court system? A, is that the theory? And B, what actually happens in practice?
Yes, that's a very nice little summary. I won't add to it of what's supposed to happen, but A, if the system is completely overwhelmed and it takes a decade for them to get to you, it becomes largely meaningless. Also, a huge fraction of these people know that they don't qualify for asylum. Remember what I said about asylum. You're fleeing for your life, right? And that's not what most of them are. They're perfectly understandable in search of a better life, but that's not asylum. Most of them won't qualify. And a lot of them don't even show up for their hearing. Some do, especially the initial hearing, but after a while, what's the point? And then remember, we have in America, this number is usually reckoned to be over 1 million now, deportation absconders. These are people who've actually had their day in court and a judge said you got to go, usually more than one, and they just don't go because we don't follow up on those judges' orders. The only time that would happen is if there was some kind of criminal arrest warrant for you. Then they might look for you. So we have a system of adjudicating asylum claims, but if the answer is no, typically you stay anyway. And so
we don't really have we don't have an enforcement system. So basically the judge says, sorry, you got to go. And the person can basically just say, well, come find me then. Good luck.
Right. And actually, we usually notify them through a letter. They used to call them, or sometimes they still do the run letter, but you don't really have to run. So, so that's a huge
Steve,
challenge.
I hate to ask this, but like, is this a joke system then? I mean, it seems crazy in some ways.
I mean, we do deport people, and many of them are criminal aliens, like people who serve time in prison, and then we deport them. But if you're a run-of-the-mill illegal immigrant who even had a denied asylum claim, the chance that you'll be deported is very low, unless they pick you up in some other enforcement activity. They go to the house to catch a murderer, and you just happen to be living with that person, and that's sometimes that person gets caught. And so there's that. It's right. And so releasing people in the United States is going to burden the country with an enormous question. What are we going to do, since they don't really qualify for asylum, right? The administration didn't give much thought to that. And Kamala Harris has kind of conceded that now in an interview that they didn't. But they're focused, and a lot of progressive Democrats tend to be focused on the fundamental humanity of these people. Look, we can let them in. They'll find a job. They'll live a much better life here than there. It's kind of mean-spirited to say no. Yes, they don't qualify. Now, there are consequences for American society to that, but you can sort of see how they end up there. I let them apply for their asylum, and they didn't hold them. They didn't use a thing called expedited removal to get rid of people quick. And once the word got out that you could get to the border and they would release you, then people showed up in huge numbers, and
Yeah,
that's
and
sort of
sorry to
what we
interrupt,
have.
but why wouldn't they? I mean, it sounds like you have a magic word, right? You're open sesame. You get to the border, you say, "I'm claiming asylum." They say, "Okay, we'll come in. We're going to process you. It might take over a decade, and even if we send you the letter saying you can't stay, well, you really can stay because we're not going to come find you. And in the interim, you get to enjoy all the benefits of being a resident of the United States, plus the support of the social systems here." Like, I totally get that. If I'm living in a country
Right.
where I feel like my prospects are limited, or I feel like I'm being persecuted for whatever. Yeah, I'm headed to the American border.
Yeah. Right. And America is somewhat ambivalent about enforcing the law. I mean, I think it's popular in a survey. You can certainly find, would people be upset if we actually enforced the law? They might. It means a lot of people who are here now would have to go home. But the decision to release people also, as I think your listeners recognize, if we have a limit on how many people we let in and criteria, the decision to release all these people into the United States and subsequently give many of them work authorization seems like you're totally ignoring the limits Congress set. You could go back to Congress and say, hey, we want to let another 2 million people in every year.
Right.
Congress can set that number, but Congress isn't doing that. The administration is, in effect, creating a legal flow. It's even more profound than that. So what they're doing is they created an app, which was actually mostly was for trade, but now what you do is you schedule an appointment, the CBP1 app, and they fly you into the United States. Now, again, you're an inadmissible alien, but they give you a hearing, and because they think maybe you have a chance at asylum, and then they release you into the United States as well. And so we've flown in, but that is in part of that 5.6 million. We've flown in hundreds of thousands of people under that provision as well.
Yeah, and sorry, I just got to ask about this because we read about this in the newspapers, and my take is that most people are kind of dumbfounded by this. So wait a minute, what is the logic for flying people in who say they want to live here?
Right. So, well, again, it stems from something I don't know if I've said it here, but let me make clear. The way a lot of people in the Democratic Party, particularly the leadership, perceive it is, look, these are desperate people fleeing desperate circumstances. And some of them might qualify for asylum. And so this is a way of helping those people and letting them avoid the horrific journeys many of them have to make. So if you're from Venezuela, you've got to kind of get through Panama for reasons I won't explain. That's very hard. Then you've got to come up through the chaos of Central America, and then you've got to get through Mexico before you get to the border. We think a huge fraction of women get sexually abused on this trip, or they sell their bodies because they really have no choice. That's how they finance it. So the amount of victimization is huge. So you could argue the administration created the problem by starting to release people at the border in large numbers, causing ever more people to come who then get abused, who then they create the second system to fly them in so they don't get abused. That's a reasonable interpretation of what's happened. But you can see the logic. Again, desperate people. What they can't seem to get their minds around is these are rational risk takers as well as desperate people, and they are responding rationally to the incentives we're creating. And that's what's created the border crisis. The reason that the numbers are down to some extent is Mexico's cutting some of it off. And the reason is probably they just don't want probably Trump to come back in, even though they don't hate Trump, because Trump doesn't harass them about human rights, but he would harass them about migration. And so the Mexicans probably are willing to stop, at least short term, a lot of it. But after the election, we would guess some of it would increase. We had a program, just very briefly, to try to stem this from a previous tide, which said, look, you can apply for asylum, you got to wait in Mexico. That cut it by 90% because the vast majority of people just wanted to be released. And if they weren't being released in the United States, they're not coming. But we ended that program on President Biden's first day. There were challenges in court to that program, probably the Supreme Court would have upheld it. But once we ended that, that was one of the things that caused the surge.
Okay. And I completely agree with the logic of your statement, which is, and again, I want to make sure an important takeaway from this discussion is in no way are we demonizing immigrants, legal or illegal. These are people that are, in most cases, responding rationally to the environments around them, either environment they desperately want to leave, or the carrot that of the incentives that we seem to be currently offering them. So I'm trying to work my way up to some of the more meaty and maybe controversial questions, but I feel like I got to pull one of them into this discussion now based upon what we're talking about here, Steve. So yes, one interpretation can be, hey, this is all humanitarian and these people have these arduous journeys here and we don't want them to experience that hardship if we can afford it. So let's fly them in or whatever. There is a sentiment out there that if we want to put a partisan angle on this is if we let a bunch of illegal immigrants into the country, they're highly likely to be appreciative of the administration that brought them into the country. And therefore, if and when they get voting rights, they will vote for that party that brought them in. I know this is probably a pretty charged question here, but from your perch, is that a factor going on in here at all?
People say that. I'm not of that opinion. I'm more of the, look, a couple quick things. Yes, research on immigrants who do vote show they vote Democratic very roughly 2-1. The reasons have to do with policy preferences, right? If you ask people, do you want more government or less government, things like that, immigrants tend to come down on the side of they want more government. They come from societies where the government plays a bigger role in the economy. So immigration does tend to shift slowly, but does shift the political balance towards Democrats. But I don't think that's really, and maybe you could say, well, a lot of Democrats don't mind the high level of immigration because someday it's going to benefit them. But there is a much more immediate effect, but it won't be realized until the next census. We do draw district lines at the state level and even at the local level based on total population counted in the census. And as I was hoping to discuss, we do count illegal immigrants in our census data. So and if you look at that, it does tend to take seats away from areas that are overwhelmingly comprised of American citizens. And we draw districts where there's a lot of non-citizens. Those districts tend to be overwhelmingly represented by Democrats. The seats where all the citizens live tend to be Republican. So the reapportionment process, probably even more than voting, tends to somewhat shift the political balance towards Democrats. But I don't think that's really the primary motive. The primary motive is a sense that enforcing immigration law, while probably necessary, it's kind of mean-spirited. It's mean to keep people out of the United States, and I think the Democrats would say, and we need people, so it's wrong to keep them out. And so I think that's their perspective. We need the workers, we need the taxpayers, what have you. And so and there are clearly winners from letting these folks in. One of them is the immigrants themselves, but there are Americans who benefit, but there are Americans who don't, and we might want to talk about that. Would it be possible to just show a chart of what some of the Census Bureau data show about immigrants in the U.S.?
I think that'd be great. Let me just close off this topic for a second. Okay, if the intent is not necessarily to bring in a bunch of new voters and gain an advantage politically, is the effect still the same here of this wave of immigration?
Yes, immigration, since we reformed the laws in 1965, has added about 85 million people to the United States. And overall, that's helped the Democratic Party, both in the way redistricting and reapportionment of seats works, both at the local and state level, and just in how immigrants vote. Not overwhelmingly, but yes, it has. And that process will likely continue. So I would say it has, yes, it's fair to say part of the effect is to benefit Democrats, even if that's not the real motivation for most people, or most
Okay.
progressives.
Okay. And then let me just ask you this question, then we'll get to your slides. I think many people look at the immigration situation as sort of like the lifeboat problem, right? You're in a ship that is sunk. There are people in the water. You're in a lifeboat, and you want to try to help as many people as possible, but you can't take everybody, right?
Right.
You take too many people in, you swamp your lifeboat, and then everybody drowns, right? So, if the intent is humanitarian and it may be humanitarian mixed with economic, like, well, this is the right thing to do, and we do need more workers. Why pursue why pursue it through the illegal side
Yeah.
versus changing the legal policy?
Well, I think everybody who believes we need more immigration, I'm not saying that's my position, I'm just saying, would say, oh, that would be better if Congress acted and let a lot more people in, right? But Congress won't act. And so we get a sort of de facto increase in immigration, even if it's a large fraction is illegal. So that's it. Total inability. Remember, the country's not clear. The most recent polls suggest used to be a plurality, wanted less immigration, and now it's a majority. In that context, are you going to vote to increase the number of people allowed in? If you're a member of Congress from a battleground district, maybe not. And so the public, it's tremendous interest group. It's hard to think of an interest group that doesn't pressure for more immigration, right? Whether it's the Chamber of Commerce or the National Association of Churches or the Catholic Church or the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society or the Realtors Association or the hotel and restaurant industry, or the landscapers and agricultural business, or the National Association of Manufacturers, or the Business Roundtable. In other words, I could sit here for an hour and list powerful interest groups that pressure for more immigration and aren't very supportive of enforcement. The one problem of reaching that new consensus in Congress is there is one interest group that doesn't generally hold that view, and that's the public. And so that's why we get total stalemate, if you will. It's not so much a left-right divide. It's kind of the common man versus what you might call the elite, opinion leaders, interest groups, however you want to talk about it. And that problem has plagued our immigration system and the politics of it, in my view, for decades. And it's why it's very hard to do anything that affects, that changes the law. Whether it's to enforce the law, to increase the numbers, to reduce the numbers, whatever, can't do it. Just tremendous political stalemate. And it seems like it's just intensifying almost in recent years with this big influx.
Okay. Gosh, I've still got so many really important questions to get to. So let me let you get to your charts, and then we'll try to bang through as many of these other key questions I know folks have as best we can.
Okay. So this first slide just looks at data for, really for the last, for the last 15, 16 years. And what it shows is the monthly growth based on a survey that the government collects called the Current Population Survey. It's where we get the unemployment numbers. About 30 years ago, they started identifying the immigrants in the data. So if you take it through at least March of this year, I have some more recent data, but it basically looks the same. What you see is that normally, so in the Trump administration before COVID, it grew by about 42,000 a month on average. But under Biden, it's growing by over 170,000. That's what this shows. That's a lot more than was under Trump, and more than double what it was even in Obama's second term.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're wondering, gosh, do these illegal immigrants even show up in the unemployment numbers or in Census Bureau data? The short answer is yes. We always thought a huge fraction did. With this recent influx, for reasons I'm not going to explain, the data has struggled to pick them up, and yet we see totally unprecedented growth in this data. 6.6 million through the first part of this year since President Biden took office. Nothing like that has ever occurred in the data. And here's the kicker. We think 1 million people go home a year on their own, at least 750,000. And there has to be just normal human mortality, 300,000 deaths. So if the population in a 3-year period grows 6.6 million, you'd have to add another 3 million on top of that just to get new arrivals.
Wow.
Because you have to, this is a net increase, not new arrivals. So this is
Got it.
extraordinary. We're picking up.
And sorry to ask this, but I think you alluded to the fact that data collection issues have maybe been more of a challenge in recent years than before,
Right.
meaning this number could very well be even worse than it is because it's not picking up as many people as it was.
Well, I won't use the word worse. I'll just say bigger.
Bigger.
Yes, the 6.6 million growth is almost certainly too low. So let me just at least place this in some kind of historical context for you. In this next slide, you see the whole history of U.S. immigration since 1850. That's the first census where we can identify the immigrants. These are the foreign-born, is another way of talking about them. These are all people who are not U.S. citizens at birth, just like that other slide, except that was recent years. So what this shows through 2024 is that the foreign-born percentage in that monthly data is 15.6% of the U.S. population, or 52 million people, about 51.6. Putting aside undercount, because there may have been undercount in the past, right? We may have missed people. If you see this big section from really 1870 to 1920, that's the so-called Great Wave. That's when we got people, we were still getting a lot of Irish and others, but that's when we started to get the huge numbers from Eastern and Southern European countries. And so that's the Great Wave. And it reached a peak in 1890, and then it got almost back to that same peak in 1910 at 14.8 and 14.7. Now, if we use the 2024 data, we've blown past it. We've never been here before as a country. Wow. That may matter, it may not. Now, that's as a percentage. Obviously, numerically, we've never been here, but the reason for that is partly that the country was much smaller in population. And just without, and we could talk about it as much as you like, but remember, in World War I in 1914, and restrictive legislation in the early 1920s greatly reduced the flow of immigrants into the United States. And that's why you see this big decline in the number of foreign-born in the United States until the laws reformed in the mid-60s. Both legal and illegal immigration began to pick up in the late 1960s, and then it's just continued from there. And that's an incredible summary of, whole multiple volume books could be written on this, but I've just given you sort of the overview. And so this is what's happening. And those red bars are, well, if we were to continue the growth we've seen in the last 3 years, this is where we'd be in 2030 and 2040. So in totally unprecedented territory. Is this level of immigration too high to facilitate assimilation? It's a reasonable question. There are lots of places in America where 70–80% of all the kids in public school are from immigrant families. If one of the ways assimilation works is that the immigrants, in effect, live in a whole sea of native-born people and their children, and that assimilation just becomes a natural process, it could be, particularly when you think of the concentration, that we're at a place we've never been before.
Hey, Steve, sorry to interrupt. I should have asked this question a lot earlier.
Yeah.
Has the composition of immigrants, either legal or illegal, materially changed at all in this recent wave?
Yeah, so we could talk about that. So the short answer is overwhelmingly. Throughout all of American history until the 1960s, immigration was overwhelmingly from Europe. After 1970, very, very roughly, though we still get European immigrants even this day, we got a shift. It became heavily from Latin America and Asia. Now we get immigrants from every corner of the world. So the demographics or the sending countries shifted. There is evidence that in the last 50 years, but this is a complicated thing, but one of the things that happened when immigration increased in the 1960s relative to the immigrants who came in the 30s, 40s, and 50s was that the education level of the immigrants relative to the native born began to fall significantly. And so immigration was more middle class when it was much lower in the mid part of the last century. And then it became much more lower income again. But that reflects partly the way it used to be during the Great Wave. It seems you can't have a great wave and have it be highly skilled. Right. Maybe you could, but that's not been true in American history. Of course, one could reasonably argue that the economy in 1900 still offered some kind of decent opportunities in manufacturing for people who didn't have a lot of education, people who may not have been literate. That's less true now. And of course, there was no welfare state in 1900. There is a very extensive one, which we could talk about. But if you bring in unskilled immigrants, when federal, state, and local spending only totals 5% of GDP, as is true in 1900, that's one thing. But if it totals 35% of GDP, as it does today, then bringing in lots of low-income people may have important implications you need to think about for your welfare state.
Okay, and to refine my question, is the surge we're seeing in the past 4 years, what is that composition of that wave? I'm going to guess it's probably on the low income side, and it sounds like regionally it's not just Latin America anymore. It's kind of everywhere.
Right. So if you look at we don't know the education level of the newest arrivals who are illegal, but we do have some other data that I'll share with you very, very soon. But it is heavily Latin American, but it's like 80%, but that share is falling, and we're getting more and more Asian, getting more Chinese, more Indian, more Middle East, more African, still heavily weighted towards Latin America. But this new surge is definitely extremely diverse, but still heavily weighted towards Latin America. And when I say Latin America, I'm including places like Haiti. So let me just show you something very quickly. This just shows the number of non-citizens in the United States overall, so there's no fancy analysis here, that are from Latin America who are more recent arrivals. They've come since 1982. We actually had a lot of illegal immigrants in the 80s. We had an amnesty for them, and then we promised to enforce the law, but we never did. And so we have a lot more illegal immigrants again. That amnesty happened in 86. It's called IRCA. We could talk about it. But the point is, so there aren't too many immigrants who are illegal who arrived before 1982, given how the amnesty worked. If we look at this population now, you can see evidence here without any fancy specification of trying to pick out the illegal immigrants in the data, why most researchers think between 2015 and 2019, there was a lot of stability in the illegal immigrant population. Again, this is just non-citizens from Latin America who arrived in the last 40 years, basically. The survey asks you when you come. So at each interval, you can look at the people who say that they've arrived after 1982. So, so this is how we can get at this number. This is my estimate for what is in the data for the illegal immigrant population, as best I can tell. Now, this is more fancy specification. Maybe around 2 million in the data. The question of undercount is not included here in the data back in 2021, and now it's probably closer to 14 million. Now, how many are getting missed is this question. It wouldn't surprise me if now the population is at 15, maybe 16 million. Remember, people are always going home. Some get deported, and we legalize a lot of folks each year. Some get asylum, some marry an American. So there's a lot of out-migration from the illegal population. People say, but all these illegal immigrants were coming even before COVID. How can the population be stable? Remember, all children born to illegal immigrants are considered American citizens. So that you can't add to the illegal population through births. There are no illegal births to illegal immigrants in the United States. We could discuss whether the 14th Amendment requires that, but that's how it is now. But
okay,
so
and
only way for it to grow is new arrivals.
All right, and just to make sure folks are following here, your estimate, your best estimate of how many illegals are currently living in the U.S. is around 15 million.
Right.
Yes. But that is the people who cross the border and are here illegally. If they've now started families here, you are not counting their children.
Right. Right.
Okay.
You know, we do have administrative data for how many legal immigrants there should be in the United States, with the caveat we don't keep great track of that. If you compare that to how many people are actually saying that they're from other countries and weren't U.S. citizens at birth, you get a number like 13.7. If you assume a reasonable undercount, you can get to 15 million. I have a lot of questions about, so we are picking up a lot of illegal immigrants in this data. If you're wondering, yes, they are included in this data. They do respond, but we're missing probably more now than we used to. My problem is, I don't know how many. I don't have a systematic way. I'm thinking a lot about it. I want to do research on that, but I don't have a great answer on that. I'm sorry to say. But it is very unlikely that the illegal population, although people say it, is 20 or 30 million. And what I was trying to get at is people are always going home. The background rate of out-migration from the United States was always assumed to be about 300,000. We have good reason to think that among just the illegals. Among all immigrants, it's 1 million. But just the illegals, it's like 300,000. They get old and they want to go home. They're tired. They worked in the United States for 10 years and they want to leave, or America is not what they hope for, or they have a man or a woman back in their home community that they want to go back and be with. They don't want to be here. So people are always going home. There's deaths among the existing population, usually reckoned to be about 50,000 as part of natural mortality. And so you could have lots of people come, but legalization, deaths, and out-migration means it doesn't grow. That's what I think people have trouble understanding. And remember, there are no illegal births to illegal immigrants in the United States, no births that add to the illegal population. So that's an important point to keep in mind. And that's why I don't think it's 20 million. If you want to have a long discussion of why I don't think it's 20 million, we can. I could summarize, but the point is, it just doesn't look like that based on the information we have. But I could be wrong. I don't want to say it's impossible, but we don't see it in things like birth records. There are that many extra people in the United States beyond what the Census Bureau data indicates. We'd see a lot more births unless illegal immigrants don't have children in the rates that we think they do. And they don't have any in school, but we don't see it in school enrollment. And there are other pieces of evidence I could tell you why I don't think it's 20 million. And most researchers agree with me that it's not. But there are a few who don't. They think it's more. So there you have it.
Okay. Well, we'll use 15 million for now.
For now. So you asked me a question about these newcomers, and this is, again, no fancy specification. I'm only looking at people who said that they came in the last 2 years and a little bit. So the way you read this is these figures show the education level for adults. The share with a high school education or less is the green line. And so back in 1994, the newest arrivals, not the total population, just the people who said that they came, and they came in this case in, 92, 93, and the first part of 94. The data is grouped in a way when they release it to people like me to analyze. I can't break it down any more than that. Anyway, so you can see 55% had no education beyond high school, and about 28% had at least a bachelor's, so had a graduate degree. Again, this is everybody, the new legal and the new illegal immigrants in this data. And you could see, that something happened or things started to improve. The fraction, particularly with a college degree, that's that blue line on the bottom for most of the chart, started going up, so that by 2010 of new arrivals, legal and illegal, 38% had a college degree and 46% had no education beyond high school. I'm excluding all those who say they have some college here, but just to keep the chart simple. Now, and that situation continued to improve until about 2018. But so that we got all the way down to 31% said that, only 31% said they had no education beyond high school. They either dropped out or had just a high school degree. And 53%, a majority, said they had a college degree. This is what, this is the first time that a majority said they had a college degree. But something's changed. During this surge, reflecting the very large illegal component, we see a reversal again. That the fraction who have no education beyond high school is now all the way back up to 44% after having hit a low of 31%. And the fraction with a college degree is down to 41%. And this has enormous implications for how these folks do in the United States. I just want to show you one simple example of this. So hopefully this is, you can see it and it's clear. This looks at use of major welfare programs based on the Survey of Income and Program Participation, which now also identifies the foreign-born. And what I'm trying to show you just simply is why bringing in people who don't have a lot of education can be problematic in some ways. So on the left, what you see in the light blue bar is 26% of households where the person has at least a bachelor's degree access one of the major welfare programs. This is cash programs like the EITC or TANF or SSI. It also includes food stamps, or you live in public housing, or you're on Medicaid, or the WIC program, the nutrition program. So 26% for households headed by someone who has at least a bachelor's degree is native born, and it's 47% if the person doesn't have a bachelor's degree. Quite a difference, right? Moving over to the green bars, we see the same pattern, though it's high. And part of the reason it's so high for immigrants is they're more likely to have children. But immigrants do have high take-up rates. I don't want to be clear, of these welfare programs. They typically get them on behalf of their US born children, or most immigrants who are legal have lived here long enough to use these programs. So it doesn't really matter. So there are bars on their using these programs, but they don't make that much difference because most people have been here long enough. Most people have US born children. They can get the benefits on behalf of the US born children. There are states that exempt them and do purposefully give them the benefits, and even illegal immigrants are allowed to receive some programs, and they can receive all programs on behalf of US born children. And there are more than 5 million US born children of illegal immigrants in the US now. So, but you still see the same pattern of immigrants in the United States. That's the light green bar of immigrant households headed by someone with at least a bachelor's degree, 34% access one or more welfare programs. But for immigrant households with less than a bachelor's degree, it's 68%. It's very high. And let me say one other thing here. It's very important. The vast majority of all these households have at least one worker. And I don't think it's right to say, or to people sometimes act like, well, these high welfare use, whether among the native born or immigrants, particularly immigrants, it represents some sort of moral defect on their part. That's not really what's happening. It's happening that you can work and collect welfare because wages are low at the bottom end, right? So when employers say, look, we can't pay more, we want more foreign workers, or we don't want to raise the minimum wage, or all those arguments, they may be good arguments, but remember, they come with a cost to taxpayers. Most of these people, somewhere around 3/4 of these households accessing these welfare programs have at least one worker. But working in no way precludes accessing the welfare system. We see that especially among immigrants, but we see that same similar pattern among the native born. And that's, I think, something people forget. Can you live in public housing and work? Yeah. If you work at Walmart and make $17 an hour and have 2 kids, you can get food stamps. You can get public housing. If you have an infant, your kid can get the WIC program. You all might be able to get Medicaid, or at least the children get Medicaid. And that's, I think, is something people forget. And that is a concern. So when employers say we want more foreign workers to work at these entry-level, low-paying jobs, there can be stimulative and positive effects from that. And we could talk about that. But there can be some real downsides. And this is one of them. Unskilled immigrants, not surprisingly, make very extensive use of welfare programs, even though they have high rates of work. So I'd love to talk more, show you more slides, but that's the instructor in me. But I've spoken a lot, so I kind of filibustered. So tell me, what's your question?
Those are super useful. We may get to some of your other ones here. I just want to take a moment and drill down into, another kind of common concern that we hear voiced, just trying to see how much there is really there around this. One of the concerns we often hear pushing back against the surge in illegal immigration that we've had here is that these people are coming in and they're basically displacing jobs that would otherwise be taken by an American citizen. And obviously, illegal immigrants, tend to accept jobs at lower wages, maybe worse working conditions than a lot of native-born Americans, can afford to accept, or maybe are willing to accept. And so, I think the logic makes sense, but how much really is there here? Is there a massive or material job displacement going on?
Yeah, so it's always a mistake to oversimplify and say that every job taken by an immigrant or an illegal immigrant is a job lost by a native-born person. That's just not the way to think about it. It's also a mistake to say that, look, you can dramatically increase the supply of workers, particularly in certain sectors lower wage sectors like building, cleaning, and maintenance, or construction, or hospitality, or retail, or transportation and moving, and have no effect. Of course, it has an effect. Just as an aside, there's a couple of pieces of evidence that has an effect, but one is the behavior of employers. If immigration had no effect on wages, then employers wouldn't lobby Congress so hard for more immigration. That doesn't make them bad. You can understand their point of view, but it does mean that they certainly think that it impacts the wage structure in the United States. And I think the evidence is they're right. It does. That's also itself not all a downside. Lower wages, say, don't vanish into thin air. They either are retained by employers in the form of higher profits, or they may be passed on to consumers in the form of lower prices. So it's not all bad, but you have to understand that when it comes to illegal immigrants, we think about 75% have no education beyond high school. So as a general rule, though there'll be lots of individual exceptions, they're going to tend to be employed in those kind of lower wage, less than $25 an hour kind of jobs. Again, not exclusively. And the concern is that Americans who don't, say, have a high school education or have only a high school education have not fared well in the last few decades, in two important ways. Generally, their wages have not been great. They've done a little better recently, but relative to, say, college educated workers, or just relative to high school only workers of the past, their real wages are down. That is adjusted for inflation. So the concern is that you're adding workers precisely to the lowest paid part of the U.S. economy, and you're making Americans, earn less as a consequence, even if the immigrants don't undercut and work for less. You're still increasing supply of labor. So it's basic economics. Now, there are other concerns there. The thing that often can happen too, though, and this is we've already touched on, is this decline in labor force participation. So what we have is a lot of people in the United States who are neither working nor looking for work, but they are of working age. They're not in prison. They're not inmates. They're on the economic sidelines. And the fraction of men who don't have a lot of education who are on the economic sidelines has been increasing for 6 decades. It is true it coincides with the increase in immigration over the last 6 decades, and immigration's probably played a role in that by reducing wages. There's also some specific research on a crowding out effect. As the immigrants come in, the labor force participation and employment of native-born, less educated men in particular declines. And there's one other big issue, we probably should talk about, but the direct competition, the concern is there is evidence that it to some extent reduces wages, and to some extent it crowds them out of the labor force. But I should say that the decline in labor force participation, it would be wrong to say that it's being caused primarily, certainly only, or even primarily by immigration. It's contributing to it, but it is not the only cause. The decline in male labor force participation is a very complex subject, as you know. And it's being caused by a whole variety of things. Probably the low wages is undermining work, probably overly generous welfare, particularly disability payments, and too easy to get, and other factors as well. The changing social expectations about men, drug abuse, substance abuse, obesity, all of these things are contributing to the decline in work among men who are of working age. And again, this is excluding inmates, people in prison or anything like that. These individuals normally should be working. And this is true if we look at 16 to 64-year-olds or focus in on the group most likely to work, the 25 to 54-year-olds without, say, a high school education. Their labor force participation looks to have declined for 6 decades. And it's a social disaster. People debate the causes. Nobody says it's a good thing. Nobody says, they're just living a bohemian lifestyle. That simply is not the case. We know that when men are out of the labor force, it's linked to all kinds of negative outcomes. which we could discuss, but that you could imagine what they are. They're social isolation. It's linked to things like suicide and overdose deaths, and just generally alcoholism, obesity. There's just a whole host of problems associated when people who should be working are on the economic sidelines. And one of the concerns with immigration isn't just the direct job competition issue. The second set of concerns has to do with allowing us as a society to ignore this problem. Because after all, why worry about all these men on the economic outs on the sidelines when we can just hire eager immigrants? And you can see that from the employer's point of view. Perfectly understandable. Yeah, okay, you know, if you've got a McDonald's and you got some 27-year-old from Central America, hardworking, enthusiastic, shows up on time, doesn't steal. Yeah, his English language skills may be an issue, but still, he shows up, he does what he's supposed to, and he's happy to take the job for $16 an hour. Where an American kid who barely graduated high school, he's 19 or 18, you got to put up with him. He may not show up all the time. He may not be as enthusiastic about the job because he knows it's not a great job. It's $16 an hour. So, and you can see how as a country, not only the employer, but as a country, we could benefit. Maybe you could argue we're getting a better worker than we might otherwise. But that comes with a huge catch. That if that kid doesn't get into the labor market and learn the values of work and learn to show up on time when he's young and learn not to tell his boss he's an idiot, even if he really is, the evidence suggests that he's much less likely to be working when he's older, say 27. So we get a better worker maybe with the immigrants, but we're socializing some fraction of our less educated population out of the world of work with all those negative consequences I talked about. And with all these guys on the sidelines, we simply are less likely to care because we have all these eager immigrants coming in.
All right, I agree 1,000% with everything that you just said there about the social crisis we really have here, about this underemployment here in America, and the sort of growing lost generation of men, and increasingly women. By the way, the amount of women in that group is growing concerningly fast. But to the initial question of sort of job displacement. What I hear you saying is it is not the only factor, but it is definitely a headwind against the challenges that you just talked about there.
Right, exactly. And there's the political consequences, like I said, letting us ignore the issue. So it's
yeah. I mean, sort of societally, it's a quick fix, right? You know, the corporation with its profit motive might be super happy to get let me get some eager, hardworking, dedicated illegal immigrant in who's going to work harder and probably work for less. That helps me in the short term as the employer, but it ignores the larger societal ill here. And if we have a society that's not actually deploying its human capital effectively, it ignores that. Eventually you end up with a problem that's much bigger than the gains that you're getting from this sort of under the table action. You're not
just to give you one statistic, if we could get the labor force participation, that is the share of working age men 16 to 64 who are either working or at least looking for work, back to what it was in 1960, we would add 9 million workers to the US economy. But that may be unrealistic. But if we could just get it back to what it was in 2000, we'd add about 4.4 million. And this is just men. For women, it would be less, but we'd still, remember, women have increased. Women increased all the way till about 2000. But for less educated women, since 2000, they've struggled somewhat. It's not quite as bad as the men. Actually, some recent stuff I've been looking at on immigrant men who are of working age and don't have a lot of education, their labor force participation increased all the way to 2006. But since 2006, it's actually down some too. Some of the same social problems that are afflicting the native born, which are very complex, and we've only just touched on them here, and that's all we can do, seem to be affecting some fraction of less educated foreign born men too.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to chuckle when you say that, but what happened in 2006? That's when the iPhone came out. Not that that's the only issue, but
well, there is research suggesting video games have a particularly destructive effect on men, whether it's in men or in terms of just studying in high school and college or looking for a job. You know, men display a lot more addictive behavior when it comes to video games. So you want to put that on your list as a problem.
Yeah. All right. Well, anything else about this topic before we move on?
No, I think maybe another thing, and you can always decide how to present it. Look, the bottom line is most Americans do not compete with illegal immigrants for jobs. They're not in the same sectors with the illegal immigrants, and they have more education and skills. Most Americans are not in competition with the illegal immigrants. The problem is those that are tend to be the poorest and least educated and the ones who are struggling the most. And so that's the problem.
By the way, Steve, I should have said this again at the beginning of the video. This is a massive topic we're trying to boil down here for folks. We're probably not going to get through everything. Would very much love, to the extent you have stamina and interest after this video, to bring you back on, maybe to do some interactive, live Q&A with the audience, but also to get to some of the topics we don't get to today. All right, so I want to jump to the impact of all of this, and you did a good job of teeing it up with those last slides there. One, can we afford to absorb this wave at the current magnitude that it is with these illegal immigrants here? They are tapping into our support systems, like welfare programs. Are those funded for this many people? I mean, I know we have a lot of problems that people would say just attending to the citizens, the actual citizens that actually live here and were born here, on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. So, if we're not doing a great job on that, how can we, afford all these other folks that are coming in and placing claims in the system? We've certainly seen where there are finite resources, say like emergency rooms and things like that, that we've heard reports of cities saying that their municipalities have been overwhelmed, ones that have taken on a sudden surge in illegal immigrants. So what is the impact these illegal immigrants are having on our social services?
Right. So the education level of the immigrant is what matters. So someone who comes to the United States illegally and has a lot of education, they're much more likely, even if they're illegal, to make money and not use as much in services and pay more in taxes, particularly if they have work authorization. So the way to think about immigration is the people who have a college degree or a graduate degree, on average, there are always individual exceptions, don't get me wrong, but on average are a net fiscal drain. They pay a benefit. They pay more in taxes than they use in services. But those people who come, putting aside legality for a minute, who don't have a college degree, some people go back and get college degrees. It takes a while, but they do it. People up their skills all the time. So don't think it's always hopeless. But those individuals, on average, the best research we have suggests that they're a significant net fiscal drain. It's not because they don't work. It's not because they're lazy. It's not because they all came to get welfare. But it's very hard to see our way around it. We don't tax people who don't make. Well, first off, the modern American economy doesn't pay people with modest levels of education very much. And at the same time, we don't tax them very much either. It's not like, so even assuming someone's paid on the books and they pay what they're supposed to, you just don't, like the example I give, you make $17 an hour and it's you and two kids, you're not paying any federal income tax. In most states, you wouldn't pay any state income tax either. So that is the fundamental dilemma. It's very hard. In the same way, maybe think of it this way. So, cities worry a lot about losing their middle class tax base because who pays all the taxes? The middle and the upper class. If you bring in a lot of low income immigrants, it's like a city losing or shrinking the relative size of its middle class tax base. If the immigrants are unskilled, but if they're skilled, then you don't have such a problem. My own analysis, based on some other research, and you could read about it, I testified before Congress about 10 days ago on this topic, is that on average, if we look at the education level of illegal immigrants, they likely create a net drain in the course of their lifetime of about $68,000, or 68 billion for every million. So it can be big, but again, it depends. It's the education levels that drive those results, not Nothing else. That, you know, is what I'm saying. They're not cheating. Sure, there's some fraud. Sure, people get benefits they're not supposed to, but that's not the big thing that causes the
Got it.
fiscal.
Okay, but it is a net economic drain, and I guess you would say um, it is a factor that dilutes the availability of resources to the population that's
The
already
net
here.
fiscal drain. Now, sometimes you'll hear people say, yes, but immigrants add, or illegal immigrants add hundreds of billions of dollars to the economy. And that is certainly true. Add more workers, you increase significantly the size of GDP.
Yep.
But that does not mean you're increasing the size of per capita GDP. In fact, because the immigrants are poor, the overall average actually goes down. My own estimates is well over $300 billion. And that was before the recent surge illegal immigrants add to the US economy. No question about it. So, but almost all of that goes to the illegal immigrants themselves in the form of wages and benefits, as it should, since they're the ones doing the work.
Mm-hmm.
So you are getting a bigger economy. It's like living in a town of 100 people and 10 people moved in. The town's economy would definitely be bigger, but it doesn't mean the original 100 people would be any richer. In fact, they might be worse off if the new 10 people were a fiscal drain, even though the economy is bigger. But so sometimes people get stuck on those numbers and think that a bigger economy is always better. Now, if the immigrants, and there is some evidence this can happen, raise the per capita income of the native born, then they would be a benefit. But the unskilled immigrants are not very likely to do that.
Yeah, and it sounds like that is not happening with this surge in largely unskilled illegal immigrants that we're currently seeing over the past couple of years. And for a country that is deficit spending at a level that it has rarely done, just to kind of keep things working, this is a net drag, not a tailwind to that. Okay. So we covered social services, the economy. All right, here's another potentially sensitive one, crime. So it certainly played a role in the rhetoric of the presidential election, the composition of these people, especially in the surge over the past couple of years, is a higher percentage of criminals than we've seen normally. One candidate has said that, hey, other countries are actively sending their criminals here, whether it's intentionally or whether it's like a country like El Salvador, where they've had a massive crackdown on crime there. And so people are saying, well, I'm not going to stay in El Salvador anymore. Well, let me go to the US, right? Is there any truth to that point of view?
I don't think we have good evidence. The charge is usually leveled against Venezuela. It is a dictatorial regime. You could imagine something like that happening. It happened in the late 70s with Cuba. They did release lots of criminals to go to the United States. So that could happen, I suppose. But I don't think we have that. On the larger question of immigrants and crime, and I'll try to answer quickly. There are basic demographic reasons why, say, immigrants overall and legal immigrants in particular should not have particularly high crime rates. One, to be a legal permanent resident, you have to submit documentation showing you don't have a criminal record in your home country. Two, the key in terms of street crime populations are really 16 to 24. They're the people in every community that commit a lot of the street crime. But the average age of arrival is older than that. And so the immigrants, there are immigrants who arrive as children. There are immigrants who come at 16, but in general, they arrive after the most crime prone ages that are, it's mostly men. Men commit most crimes, especially violent crime. And the immigrants arrive after that. So they shouldn't have particularly high crime rates. And finally, if you're foreign born and not a US citizen, if you're a legal immigrant and you haven't become a citizen, or you're an illegal immigrant and you commit a crime, most, not all, but most of those people do get deported. And as a consequence, they don't have recidivism. In any given year, a huge fraction of crime is committed by people who already have criminal records and have actually served time. That should happen less with the foreign born. Now, having said all that, when you focus on illegals in particular, we don't have good data. The one place where there's been a lot of debate is Texas, where they do try to make a lot of effort to identify the illegal immigrants in their custody. And it's not easy. Okay. And you think, well, it shouldn't be easy. It's not. Just trust me on that. What happens is if you look at the Texas data for like murders and rapes, when people are initially incarcerated, it doesn't look like there's that many illegal immigrants in the data. And so people say, see, they're not murderers and rapists. And of course, that'd be a terrible characterization for illegal immigrants overall. Only a tiny fraction would ever commit serious crime anyway, in any human population. So you say, well, their rates are real low. However, if you look at people who've been incarcerated in Texas for 6-7 years, the rates go way up. And the reason is it takes Texas time to identify people. If you look at that data over time, you do find that illegal immigrants may, and I emphasize may, do have high crime rates for sexual assault and murder. For the less violent and less serious crimes, they often get released before they're ever identified because it takes years to identify. So very complicated statistical picture. And so, but the assertion that just an out and out assertion that illegal immigrants have high crime rates is not justified based on the data we have. And also the idea that, oh, clearly they have low crime rates, which you'll see people say, that's probably not justified either. But there's a second issue. One of the issues that this comes to the fore is lots of jurisdictions are what we call sanctuary jurisdictions. And that often, not always, involves a jurisdiction. So they arrest someone for drunk driving. And it turns out when they submit their name to the government that they're an illegal immigrant previously deported for a serious crime. But the jurisdiction, when the immigration service says, hey, would you hold that person? We're coming tomorrow to pick him up, they release the person. And the reason they do is they feel like if they cooperate in any way with ICE, it'll poison relations with their immigrant community. Now, we really don't have any good evidence that that's the case, but that's the fear. And so the release of people who are arrested seems unwise because while I don't think the evidence is very clear that illegal immigrants themselves overall have high crime rates, illegal immigrants who get arrested is a group with very high crime rates. Those in jail do have high crime rates. And so that policy of releasing people when it's called ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, asks a jurisdiction to hold someone seems extraordinarily unwise. But that is what they do. And so, if we had a better media and a better political debate, then that's what people would talk about. Should a jurisdiction release? So that is a policy matter where I do think that that doesn't make much sense, but we are doing it.
Okay. So if I can kind of encapsulate what you said, there's not a lot of data to suggest broad brush, illegal immigrants equals criminals. But there is a mix of some data we're seeing, again, and this is mostly to the relatively recent surge of the past couple of years, that there may be a higher composition than previous of criminal elements. You combine that with some policies that we have that seem unwise, that might let recidivism happen. Criminals get released, they commit crimes again. And then third, I'm just going to toss this in and let you react to it, is there just a law of large numbers issue going on here? Whereas if you increase the number of illegal immigrants coming in and there's an X amount percent that are likely to engage in crime, you're just going to have more observable crime.
Right. And that could be exactly. I would disagree in the sense that I don't know that we know what the background crime rate of the new arrivals is. When we study it, when I said that Texas data showed high crime rates for murder and sexual assault, that was for people who'd been here for a while. These are people like sentenced in 2015, and by 2023, lots of them had been identified in the Texas prison system. So that has nothing to do with the recent surge. We don't know what this recent surge is going to show us. I mean, I don't think we have a good sense. A lot of anecdotal data. There is the separate question of organized crime or gang activity. But see, historically, organized crime often is ethnic based because you need high levels of trust for a criminal organization to function if it's an actual organization. And so that's why you had, Italian or Irish gangs 100 years ago. So we do see El Salvadoran and now Venezuelan gangs. But it would be wrong and unfair to say, well, that's very typical of this group. And I know that's just not justified. Though the gangs may be real. And if you're releasing a lot of people and not vetting and not trying to follow up, you're going to expose your communities to that risk.
Let me ask you this too. Has there been an increase in organized crime along with this increase in illegal immigration over the past couple of years? I recall from when we were talking about having this, doing this interview, if I heard you correctly, you said that sometimes these gangs will use waves of migrants as a distraction to be able to then, in the case of the southern border, we've certainly seen fentanyl usage and the fentanyl crisis surge over the past couple of years. And is there meaningful there's correlation there? Is there meaningful causation in there as well?
Yeah, so we do think that certainly we know that sometimes the cartels, which control the border, will send a lot of illegal immigrants across, and then those individuals get caught. They have to be processed by Border Patrol, and that reduces the patrol in that area, and then they can try to smuggle the fentanyl across. Fentanyl also comes across at ports of entry, but when the whole system is overwhelmed, when a huge fraction of Border Patrol agents are simply doing paperwork to process people, it certainly facilitates the entry of all kinds of other illegal things into the United States, including illicit drugs. So a chaotic border is very helpful if you want to bring in fentanyl. So I guess that's sort of the short answer. It's also helpful if you want to bring in any other sort of illegal thing, right? Gucci bags that are pirated or anything else. But yeah, it's an enormous vulnerability.
Okay. Two last questions and then we'll wrap it up. I'm going to ask the audience at the end to let us know if they'd like to see us do some continued interviews on this. I think the answer is going to be an overwhelming yes, Steven. So thank you for for your expertise and your endurance through this long discussion. I want to ask quickly about the feasibility of deportation. So candidate Trump has said, "Hey, if I get elected, I'm going to basically empower ICE to get rid of a ton of the illegals that have come in." Is that possible? What's the likelihood of that actually happening if they decide they want to do it, and what would the implications be?
Yeah, so obviously there's been a big cutback in deportations, interior enforcement in the United States, and you could really ramp that up. You could probably deport a couple 100,000 people a year more than we're doing right now. So we're not doing that much. But so is that mass? I don't know. I guess that's a undefined term. But if you wanted to actually control the situation, putting aside the things you would want to do at the border and the ports of entry, the main thing you'd want to do is cut illegal immigrants, off from jobs. Most illegal immigrants don't have work authorization, even if several million do. And so you would use a thing called e-verify. You'd make that mandatory. And then employers would have to verify that their workers are legal. It's politically popular, but neither Trump nor Harris has mentioned it or endorsed it. But it's the obvious thing. Going back 40 years, people who said if we're serious about enforcement, we have to have worksite enforcement. And e-verify, it's a system, it's up and running, it's voluntary, believe it or not. And it's been voluntary for a couple of decades now, but that would be central. You'd have to stop jurisdictions from releasing people from prison, and you'd have to get more cooperation from jurisdictions. There are ways to do that, but that would be challenging. So they would be some of the main things you'd want to do. So for example, just to give you one example, as I said, we have 1 million people in the United States who've actually had their day in court, and a judge said no, but we didn't make them leave. They're the deportation absconders. They're usually referred to. Start with them. We have names, we have sometimes addresses, we have fingerprints. There's a lot to start with right there. They should be your target. So what you'd want to do is also curtail the benefits that illegal immigrants can receive, like driver's license, like in-state to college tuition, which some states offer, and things like that. So you'd want to holistically approach this. I don't think you want to try and deport. These people sometimes have millions of people a year. None of that's possible. So it's a little like, saying, as a guy who's overweight, it's like saying, hey, I'd like to lose 25 pounds in the next week. Yeah, good luck with that, right? It's not a reasonable thing. You have to you have to lose a pound a day. Well, we got into this problem over years of neglect and issues and bad policy. It's going to take years to get out. But I do think we could create a big difference. And here's the kicker. Prior research suggested that at least 300,000 illegal immigrants went on home on their own each year. If people couldn't get jobs and other benefits, and if they saw that in the enforcement system was back in business, I think you could expect 500, 600,000 people a year to leave on their own. And then after half a decade, it would go from a national crisis maybe to a national nuisance. You're not going to eliminate the whole thing. It's like any law enforcement setting. But I think that's what we could do. We bring those numbers down with sustained enforcement, and many people would go home on their own.
Okay. I am lamenting, I'm grieving the many questions that I haven't had a chance to ask already, but we're going to save those for the next iterations of this. Closing question for you here is, what reforms to either or both of the legal and illegal immigration systems, do you think would be wise for this country to consider strongly?
Well, we had a commission in the 90s, and it was headed by the late Barbara Jordan. Barbara Jordan was a civil rights icon, the first African-American woman elected from the South after, since Reconstruction. And she headed a commission, and she made a bunch of suggestions. She said things like the lottery should be done away with. That makes sense. Her position was everybody who's supposed to get in should get in, and that should be processed quickly. And everyone who's supposed to not be here is supposed to be kept out or made to leave. And she said, if you don't have that, then you don't have an immigration system. She also suggested curtailing the family categories, and I think that makes sense. I'm not that sympathetic to the argument we don't, and we never got to this question. It's an area I spent a lot of time studying, that we have a terrible shortage of unskilled labor in the United States. I don't think that's is correct. We have a lot of people out of the labor force. So I would want to have an immigration system that doesn't add to the population without a college degree. We know that that population hasn't done well, particularly men. The fraction out of the labor force is enormous. And remember, they don't show up as unemployed because they're not looking. That's what makes them out of the labor force. So we have that problem. But real wages have generally stagnated or declined for that group. And relative to skilled workers, they've done worse. Actually, the last year or so isn't so bad. But the point is the long-term trend is terrible for that group. And so my sense is that if you want to have an immigration system and a generous system, you've got to be more selective. And I think that's what most people think. And as I said, right now, we're at a place we've never been with the foreign-born or the total immigrant population, and that should guide policy. I'm not sure. I think that's one of the factors that's creating so much public dissatisfaction, and we need to bring those numbers down.
All right, very well said, and I very much appreciate that you talked about the domestic out of the labor force crisis, which I'll say we
I have a great
here.
slide on that if you want to see it.
Well, I've done maybe we'll save that for next time, but I've done interviews with folks like Nicholas Eberstein, who's written at length about this.
Nick well, yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, so we have a tremendous underemployment problem with our domestic labor force, but before we just willy-nilly grab bodies from outside the U.S. to work these low-skilled jobs, we have to say, hey, how do we get these people who aren't doing anything but are able-bodied and of working age? How do we get them back in the labor force to do those jobs? So, anyways, I'll cut my opining there for now. Nick, this has been fantastic. For folks that would like to follow you and your work in between this video and the next time you appear on this channel, where should they go? Yeah,
well, all of our stuff is free at CIS.org, CIS, like Center for Immigration Studies.org. We do put out, we have a Twitter, Center for Immigration Studies. I guess you're not supposed to call it Twitter now, it's X. We also have a big following for my colleague, Mark Krikorian. It's easy to find us on Twitter. I don't have social media. I'm not a huge fan of social media. I feel like the complexity of the issues does not lend itself to whatever 280 characters. So, yeah. But that's just me.
All right. Well, look, when I edit this, Steve, I'll put up the link there to the CIS website and to its X Twitter handle, so folks know exactly where to go. Folks, those links will be in the description below this video as well. Folks, if you have enjoyed this, would like to show your appreciation for Steve for giving us such an unbelievable amount of data in this discussion. And if you'd like to see him come back on to continue building on this conversation, please let him know by hitting the like button, then clicking on the red subscribe button below, as well as that little bell icon right next to it. And as I said, I know there are a lot of questions that we didn't get a chance to get to here. Hopefully we covered the really big ones, but if there are additional questions that you would really like to see Steve tackle the next time he comes back on, let me know in the comments section below. I'll read them all, I'll collate them, and I'll try to pull as many as I can into any future conversations we have on this topic. Steve, can't thank you enough, my friend.
Sure. Happy to do it.
All right. Everybody else, thanks so much for watching.